Well, thank you, Michaela, and thank you for all being here. It's great to be in Warsaw once again and to be able to talk about these grave issues. What I'm going to do in about 20 minutes is to talk about energy infrastructure and the security issues around it, but I'm looking at it from a particular lens, and that is through the saga of the Nord Stream pipelines. And one of the reasons that I'm doing this is that we have some relatively new information. I have been working with Ben Schmidt and Mikhail Kotaki, former Polish minister, on doing a number of research on essentially sabotage across the Baltic and North Sea infrastructure. And one of the projects was actually related to the Nord Stream pipelines and what happened. And I think it does provide a degree of, what's the word I'm looking for? A degree of insight into what can happen and some ideas of how to then deal with it. Now, if I've got this correct, right, there we are. So, when we look at the Nord Stream pipelines, we have to remember that in terms of energy infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, it probably at the time was the single largest investment in the Baltic Sea. It was physically in the Baltic Sea. Now, of course, we've had the September 22 explosions on 3 of the 4 pipelines. That created a lot of controversy. There is lots of allegations that it was the Ukrainians, it was the Poles, it was the Brits, everybody apparently but Moscow. And you've had particularly German actors arguing for the restoration of the pipelines. And one of the points, I think, in all of this is that, which is quite interesting, is that the actual scale of the damage done was not that great. So Wood Mackenzie, the energy analysts, suggest that it would cost about $500 million to bring the pipelines back into operation. So so what I argue really here is to think about it in terms of the lessons that can be learned and where perhaps we should go in the future. Now, what I'm going to do to start with is perhaps look at the geopolitical context, which I think really we cannot ignore in all of this. Now, we've got a state-on-state, full-scale war on this continent. And what is clear, I always say with the Russians, if what they say, you should listen, because they might actually mean it. And when they say they're not fighting Ukraine, they're fighting NATO or the collective West. We should take them quite seriously. That is what they're doing. And it's also clear, and this I actually think feeds into a lot of the concern about energy infrastructure, is that they are working with and getting support from China, North Korea, and Iran. So that raises, to my mind, in energy infrastructure terms, a lot of questions. Are we looking at using wind turbines which are from China with Chinese technology, which could potentially be cut off? And that is certainly a concern that's been expressed in the US and also in the UK. We've got the sense of more broader support. We've seen Chinese ships operating in the Baltic Sea in apparent cooperation of sabotage attempts with the Russian Federation. And I don't think we can necessarily rely on the fact that Russia is in that much economic trouble. Because the point about it is that in 1814, the Russians got as far as Paris because they were funded by the British Treasury. In 1945, they got as far as Berlin because they were funded by the US Treasury. And the question is how much support are the Chinese prepared to provide in order to keep the Russians going? I think that is a question here which we cannot ignore. And there is a great paper written by Justin Bronk, who's a professor at the Royal United Services Institute in London. He published that in December of last year, 23, in which he argued that one of the options that we have to face going forward is the prospect of a two-front war, that is, simultaneously a reinforcement of the attacks from Russia in the West and on NATO territory, and also the prospect at the same time of an attack on Taiwan. And that sense of danger and Russian-Chinese cooperation is reinforced for me recently as I've read Kevin Rudd's new book on Xi Jinping's thought. And Rudd is former Prime Minister of Australia, a fluent Mandarin speaker, and he has gone through a lot of the work and thinking of Xi Jinping. And you come out the other end of thinking that this guy is a true believer in Marxist-Leninism and is very much a kind of Marxist nationalist. And you can see the potential hostile direction of travel against the West as a whole. So none of this is, how can I put it, looking very positive. And then in that context, you start thinking about the potential for sabotage across the Baltic and North Seas. When we've created all the infrastructure in the sense that there has been the end of history and we don't have to worry that much about security anymore, when in fact we do. And then if you think about the role of the Baltic Sea. Let me see if I can do that. Okay. Then, there we are. Role of the Baltic Sea. We can see the potential vulnerability. Now, it's critical for the operation of the European Union single market, more directly in terms of energy and communication terms, for the rollout of wind power across the region. And of course, it provides access to NATO naval assets, enhancing our security. But on the other hand, it is not a NATO lake. I know you see, after the accession of Finland and Sweden, the discussion about the Baltic Sea being a NATO lake. But in fact, this is not the case. It is you still have the Kaliningrad naval salient, and you have the Russian control of the area of the eastern Gulf of Finland. And of course, critically, you have got, for the Russians, the access to the sea for the seaborne oil trade. These things are not small. So in all of this context, you can see Nord Stream. Why on earth would you allow the Nord Stream pipeline to run? Because when we look at this, we see several things which are, to say the least, disturbing. I mean, by building that pipeline, we were creating, through the exclusive economic zones of several European and NATO states, the ability for Moscow to have a justification for putting their naval vessels all over and all around the Baltic Sea. In addition to which, if Nord Stream 2 had been fully brought on board, we would have had 110 billion cubic meters of gas running through what would largely be a 2-kilometer corridor. I mean, nobody in their right mind, from a security point of view, would have ever considered this to be anything other than a major supply security risk, from not merely sabotage, but even accident, whatever. You just would not do that. And that's before, we actually get to a situation we have now where we have all-out war in Europe and the explosions. And one of the questions that I've got with all of this was that, this all happened because, of course, it was possible under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, under UNCLOS. But if we take account of the supply security issues and the potential direct security issues, we should have been able to argue the case even then, beforehand, before it was built, that this was too much of a security risk. And we should have been able, UNCLOS does not stop. When you have got concrete security arguments, we should have been able to stop the building of those pipelines. But of course, we didn't. So then I'm going to talk briefly upon the Nord Stream issues themselves. So the explosion issues. So we have the explosions. It's very strange. So we have the first, there's, the Nord Stream pipelines. There's not two pipelines, there's four. There's Nord Stream 1A, Nord Stream 1B, Nord Stream 2A, Nord Stream 2B. So the first explosion was on Nord Stream 2B at just after 2 a.m. on the 26th of September. The Nord Stream 1A and B pipelines, the explosions happened 17 hours later. And it was a significant methane release event, so great in fact that it triggered seismic readings in a number of EU states. So what we get to start with, and you can argue that this itself is quite suspicious, is that within hours we had a disinformation operation underway from Moscow. So they used a narrative from pre-invasion when Chancellor Scholz and President Biden were meeting, and they were discussing if the Russians invaded, would they impose sanctions. And of course, Biden was saying in the Oval Office, we will indeed stop Nord Stream 2. But he was talking about it in terms of a sanctions response to a Russian invasion. He wasn't talking about blowing it up. But that clip was, within hours of the explosions, was busily running around with a lot of backup disinformation narratives seeking to blame the UK. So what do we actually know? And what we actually know is this. I mentioned Nord Stream 2B. Now, Nord Stream 2B, the second half of Nord Stream 2B, was not actually constructed by Western construction companies. It was constructed by Russian engineers and Russian construction firms because of sanctions imposed by the United States in 2019. The very point on which the Nord Stream 2 pipeline had its explosion was the point at which the Russians took over. Now, the second thing is, what was also observed at the time this construction was taking place was that there was a Russian serviceman on the vessels, including from this Baltic Fleet Special Purpose Detachment number 313 for countering underwater diversionary forces. Now, you can make of that what you like, but indicative. In June of 2022, so about a couple of months before the explosions, we have operations of Russian dark vessels in and around the blast zone, including one capable of underwater surveillance and launching remotely operated vehicles. And then we have dark vessel run operations in the run-up to the explosions around the 20th, 22nd of September, just before the explosions happened. And then we have, immediately after the explosions, we have a series of Russian vessels turning up who are escorted away by NATO vessels. But 3 of those Russian vessels who were there at the scene just after the explosions or attempting to get to the scene were then found in, on and around the Baltic Connector incident in 2023. Now, that is not conclusive proof that Moscow was up to no good, but let's put it like this, it's indicative. And would probably be sufficient to win in a civil case, if not a criminal case, on a balance of probabilities. Then we have the incentives. So the question you get is, why is Moscow blowing up its own pipelines? Well, the answer to that, well, it's already blown up its export market. You know, Moscow had a deal, at least for Western Europe, we would reliably provide gas for over 50 years, ever since August of 1968, when the first gas arrived in Austria. And they blew it up. So why wouldn't they blow up the pipelines? Well, they would also, there's a key issue here. When they stopped providing gas from the spring of 2021, they began to breach all their long-term supply contracts. That resulted in creating significant civil liability for Gazprom. So one of the real key points here is by having the explosions and then using disinformation to undermine the idea of Russian liability, you're able to put forward a force majeure argument. And that force majeure argument caps your liability. Because we don't quite know about all of the scale of the arbitration cases being brought. Uniper recently got an award for about 13 billion euro in June. I understand that Orlen has a claim for about 5 billion against Gazprom. But as I'm aware, all of those cases only run for the liability to the 26th of September 2022 and not after, because of the force majeure argument. If Gazprom is liable, for the Nord Stream explosions, or Russia is, then the liability goes on to much more significant sums. And I think I've only got a little time left, but then just to give you some element of the disinformation which is running, and I think these are the sort of lessons you can take from it. This is the boat which is supposed to have carried out those explosions, according to Russian propaganda, the Andromeda. If you just look at the size of it, you just think about how absurd this is. So the argument was a bunch of Ukrainians, they carried out the explosions from the operations from that little sailing boat. I mean, there's the size of the boat itself. There's the technical feasibility issues. I mean, when you ask professional divers and underwater experts, they say, well, you'd probably use a remote operated vehicle, an ROV. You wouldn't use divers for this. There's the actual weather conditions at the time, which meant there was just about 24 hours when you could have used a sailboat in and around the platforms, which was inadequate time to do so. We also have the fact that one of the people who hired the Andromeda boat is actually on a list of Ukrainian traitors, and one of the people who participated in it is actually living in the Russian Federation and freely blogging on social media. Now, there comes a point when this is absurd. So, but I think it's interesting that the disinformation used, when you actually unpack it, clearly is absurd. But yet it has gained this ridiculous traction, which is a lesson for ourselves is we need to be better at taking out the disinformation. So my lesson is finally, very briefly, we have to be aware of state-sponsored foreign energy infrastructure. We also need to understand its vampiric nature. I mean, one of the questions is will Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 be revived? And there's a significant Russo-German lobby pushing for that. We should not assume good faith application of treaties by hostile or potentially hostile foreign powers. We need to have a much stronger hybrid approach to this. We've got to basically really think through how treaty systems and infrastructure systems can be used against us. And we need also, in addition to the preventative and curative issues that ministers were talking about just now, we need to have a much more offensive to deter. We have to create levers, and one I mentioned here is the seaborne oil trade in the Baltic Sea. We need to create levers where if Moscow starts playing with our infrastructure, they, for example, lose access to their ability to move the seaborne oil trade through the Baltic Sea. And we must be prepared, if necessary, to develop new treaty methods to deal with this. One of the points here, and I'll stop here, one of the points about it which I think is really important to consider is what we really need to look at is potentially developing new treaty rules. The problem with UNCLOS and a lot of the treaty structures, they were never created, never envisaged the sort of hostility we have. And international law has always developed as a result of problems that exist for where the existing treaty systems had not been applied. So one of my views about it is the NATO states in the Baltic Sea with other allies could create a treaty which would set a whole series of approaches for dealing with this at a very broad level. They may be in breach of UNCLOS, but we say this is a development of public international law. It's proportionate, it's reasonable. Other states have similar interests. And it won't be everybody who will agree, but sufficient numbers of states will agree that it will become practice in public international law to protect ourselves. And on that, I'll stop. Okay, thank you very much.